Mason opened the wedding invitation box and felt his breath stop as the truth stared back at him. Every card carried the groom's name, yet none of them carried his. 200 invitations, all printed with the name of Clara's ex, Ethan Collins. Clara laughed it off, calling it a harmless mistake. Linda chimed in, urging him not to overthink. But the silence between their words felt heavier than the typo itself. Mason sensed something deeper hiding behind their casual tone. A secret they hoped he would ignore. A truth he was never meant to see. Mason stood in the living room, holding the first invitation between his fingers. The ink was clean, the layout perfect, but the groom's name was wrong. He blinked twice, hoping it was his eyes, not the paper. Then he reached into the box and checked a second card. The same name appeared again, printed in bold elegance. Ethan Collins. The man Clara once loved. The man she claimed to have left behind without hesitation. A cold weight settled on Mason's chest as he checked a third card. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. Every single one carried the same name, like a quiet accusation. 200 cards, whispering a story he had never been told. Clara walked in and saw the scattered invitations around his feet. She forced a smile that trembled at the edges. She said it was nothing more than a silly mistake. She blamed a wrong file on her computer. She insisted she had been exhausted and careless. Linda followed right behind her with a reassuring voice. She told Mason not to take everything so seriously. She said couples fight over smaller things all the time. But her tone felt rehearsed, like a script she had memorized. Mason looked at Clara and waited for her eyes to meet his. She kept looking at the floor, pretending to straighten envelopes. Her hands shook even though her face tried to stay calm. He asked her how Ethan's full name ended up on 200 prints. She shrugged and repeated the same excuse as before. A wrong file. A typo. A meaningless mix-up. But Mason heard something off in her voice. Something thin. Something hollow. A truth stretched too far to remain believable. He lifted an invitation and placed it gently on the counter. He asked her when she last spoke to Ethan. Clara froze for half a second before forcing another smile. She said she had not talked to him in years. She said she barely remembered his number. Mason listened to the words, but not the story. The silence between her sentences said more than she did. Linda stepped closer with a soft sigh. She tried to pat Mason's arm like he was a child upset over a toy. She said love requires patience and trust. She said he should not jump to conclusions. But Mason saw the nervous glances Clara and Linda exchanged. It was the look of people trying to stay ahead of a collapse. He felt his stomach twist as an old fear returned. The fear of being the last person to know the truth. The fear of being the only one playing fair in a crooked game. Clara finally reached for his hand, but he stepped back. Her smile wavered, and her voice softened into pleading sweetness. She promised it meant nothing. She promised she loved him. She promised the cards were a mistake, just like she had promised so many other things. Mason stared at the invitations one more time. The name, Ethan, seemed to glow beneath the lights. Not a typo. Not a glitch. Not a harmless accident. It was a message he was never supposed to read. And now he could no longer unsee it. Mason sat alone at the kitchen table long after Clara and Linda stopped speaking. The invitations were stacked neatly in front of him, like evidence waiting for a verdict. He tried to breathe slowly, but each breath felt thick and heavy. Clara's excuses replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. The wrong file. The harmless mistake. The exhausted bride who simply clicked the wrong name. None of it fit the precision of 200 perfect prints. He imagined her at the computer, choosing fonts and layouts. He imagined her typing Ethan's full name letter by letter. He imagined her smiling softly, without even realizing it. A quiet ache pressed into his ribs as the truth sharpened. He was not the man she pictured when she built this wedding. He was the placeholder she tried to mold into certainty. The thought struck him harder than he expected. He stood up and paced the room in slow circles. The air felt too tight, like the apartment had shrunk around him. He replayed every time Clara brushed off a concern. Every moment she told him not to worry. Every time Linda stepped in to shield her daughter. He wondered how long he had been living on assurances instead of honesty. His hand brushed against the wedding binder on the counter. Inside it were receipts, contracts, and deposits for every detail of their big day. He opened it and flipped through each page with cold, deliberate focus. The venue confirmed. The catering locked in. The band reserved for months. Everything was polished and perfect, except the truth between them. A quiet clarity settled in his mind, as crisp as winter air. He realized he no longer wanted to fix the wedding. He wanted to fix his life before it hardened into regret. He grabbed his laptop and began the long process of unwinding the plans. He canceled the venue with a short, steady message. He paid the penalty fee without hesitation. He reached out to the photographer and ended the contract. He contacted the caterer, the florist, and the band one by one. Each cancellation cost him money, but it bought him something better. Control. Freedom. Self-respect he refused to lose. His phone buzzed with messages from vendors asking if he was sure. He replied yes, every time without a second thought. The weight on his chest began to loosen as the wedding unraveled. He could finally see the exit from a future built on half-truths. He opened the shared wedding account last. The numbers shone bright on the screen, untouched and full. He transferred every dollar into his personal savings. His hands were steady, even peaceful, as he closed the laptop. He stood in the quiet apartment and listened to the stillness. It was the first honest moment he had felt in weeks. He knew Clara would explode when she learned what he had done. He knew Linda would storm in with accusations and blame. But for the first time, he was ready. He had chosen himself, and there was no going back. Mason woke before sunrise with a calmness that felt unfamiliar. The apartment was quiet, untouched, and almost indifferent to what he planned next. He sat at his desk and opened a blank email window. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting for the truth he had avoided for too long. He typed slowly at first, choosing each word with steady precision. He announced the wedding was officially canceled. He explained that plans had changed, and no further arrangements would continue. He kept the tone polite, clear, and undeniably final. Then he added a new line that made him breathe a little easier. He invited all guests to a different gathering. A lighthearted event called the newly single celebration. A party meant to mark a new beginning, rather than mourn an ending. He felt a small ripple of relief as he reread the message. It was honest, clean, and free of the confusion Clara had wrapped around him. He attached the guest list and triple-checked every address. With one deep breath, he pressed send. The message shot into the world faster than his doubts could catch it. Within minutes, notifications flooded his phone. Guests replied with shock, curiosity, and sympathy. Some asked if he was okay. Some simply said they understood more than he realized. And some were already excited about the celebration. The email spread through group chats, cousins, coworkers, and old college friends. By the time the sun rose fully, nearly everyone had opened it. The reactions were loud, even though the apartment remained silent. At 8 o'clock sharp, Clara's phone began buzzing on the nightstand. She stumbled out of the bedroom, half awake, confused by the noise. She unlocked her screen and froze when she saw the subject line. Her breath hitched as she read Mason's message again and again. The color drained from her face as the reality sank in. She shouted his name with a mix of anger and disbelief. He stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, letting her voice echo. She stormed toward him with her phone shaking in her hand. She demanded to know why he sent the email. She demanded to know why he humiliated her in front of everyone. Mason didn't raise his voice or defend himself. He simply reminded her that 200 invitations held another man's name. She tried to claim it was still a mistake. She tried to twist his calmness into cruelty. But the crowd of unread excuses had lost its power. Linda burst through the door moments later, already angry. She accused Mason of overreacting and destroying Clara's future. She shouted about embarrassment, finances, and appearances. Mason let their anger crash against him like distant waves. He told them both the wedding was over. He told them the decisions were final. He told them the email was sent because the truth was overdue. Clara stared at him with trembling disbelief. Her phone buzzed again, with messages from confused guests. Her anger grew hotter with every vibration. She realized the entire wedding had unraveled before she even woke up. She realized Mason had taken back control she assumed he would never claim. And for the first time, she understood he was no longer the man she could persuade. He had written a single email, but it carried the weight of everything she thought she had hidden. And there was no undoing it. Clara's fury erupted the moment she realized the wedding was gone for good. She paced the living room with frantic steps, her voice rising in sharp, broken bursts. She accused Mason of betrayal, humiliation, and cruelty. Her hands shook as she pointed at him like he had committed some unforgivable crime. Linda stood behind her daughter, matching every shout with one of her own. She called Mason irresponsible for canceling the venue. She claimed he owed them compensation for the emotional chaos. She insisted he had ruined Clara's life by acting impulsively. But Mason remained still, letting their accusations wash over him without a reaction. He knew arguing would only feed the fire they carried. Clara stepped closer, her face tight with disbelief and rage. She demanded he fix everything immediately. She demanded he resend an email explaining the wedding was back on. She insisted the guests would forgive him once he apologized. Mason calmly told her there was nothing left to restore. He told her the contracts were canceled, the deposits forfeited, and the celebration undone. Clara's eyes widened as if she had just been struck. She lunged toward the binder on the counter and flipped it open. When she saw the cancellation confirmations, her voice cracked. She shrieked that he had no right to make decisions without her. Linda grabbed the binder next and flipped through the pages with shaking fingers. She gasped at the fees, the lost payments, and the empty schedule. Then she spun toward Mason with a venomous glare. She announced he owed Clara restitution for the financial damage. She demanded he reimburse every dollar Clara should have received. Mason refused without hesitation. Linda's face hardened, and she stormed out of the apartment. 30 minutes later, Mason received a message from her. It was a detailed invoice for nearly $28,000. The list included imaginary expenses, inflated estimates, and emotional damages. He read it once and closed the message without replying. But the storm had only begun. Clara, trembling with rage, went to Mason's office drawer while he was in the kitchen. She searched through old documents until she found a stack of unused checks. Checks bearing Mason's name and account number. She tore one from the booklet and filled it out with tense, hurried strokes. She wrote $15,000 to Linda. She forged Mason's signature with a shaky imitation. Then she slipped the check into her purse as if the theft would go unnoticed. What she didn't realize was that Mason had installed a small camera in the hallway months earlier. Not for security against her, but for package thefts in the building. It caught everything with quiet clarity. That evening, Mason saw the footage and felt something inside him settle. The forged check was no longer a betrayal. It was proof. Proof he needed to protect himself legally and emotionally. The next morning, He called his lawyer and explained everything. He handed over the video, the invoice, and the forged check. The lawyer's expression tightened with recognition of a familiar pattern. He told Mason the evidence was more than enough. He advised Mason to ask Clara to move out immediately, with law enforcement present if necessary. Mason followed the advice without hesitation. When he informed Clara, her outrage turned to panic. She screamed that he was destroying her life. She screamed that he was heartless and ungrateful. But her voice no longer held power over him. She had crossed a line that could not be undone. And Mason finally felt the shift. He was no longer the one being cornered. He was the one walking away. Clara arrived the next afternoon, with 2 officers standing behind her. Not by choice, but because Mason insisted on having them present. She glared at him as if the police were an insult rather than protection. Linda followed close behind, her face twisted with righteous indignation. She muttered loudly about injustice and humiliation as she stepped inside. The officers explained the rules calmly and firmly. Clara had 1 hour to gather her belongings. She was not allowed to take anything that legally belonged to Mason. She was not allowed to damage property or interfere with his space. Clara nodded with fake composure, but her eyes simmered with resentment. She walked toward the bedroom in stiff, dramatic strides. Linda kept trying to argue with the officers, insisting Clara was the victim. The officers ignored her and reminded her to stay focused on the task. Clara began stuffing clothes into suitcases with theatrical speed. Her movements were harsh, and each drawer opened with unnecessary force. She slammed doors, tossed shoes, and ripped hangers from the closet rod. Mason stood in the hallway, silent and steady, watching her undo what once was a future. Linda wandered into the kitchen and opened every cabinet she found. She muttered insults under her breath while inspecting the spices on the shelves. Then, with a smirk, she loosened each lid just enough to spill. She shook bottles of seasonings and tilted containers on their sides. Small acts of spite that she thought would go unnoticed. Clara did not settle for subtlety. When she reached the living room, she saw Mason's leather chair. She dragged her keys across the surface in one deliberate stroke. The scratch carved through the material like a bitter signature. The officers warned her immediately, but she shrugged with false innocence. She claimed it was an accident, though her smirk betrayed her. She moved on to the mattress next, tearing sheets off with violent urgency. She jabbed the fabric with a hairpin until small punctures appeared. Each act was petty, cruel, and designed to provoke a reaction Mason refused to give. Then she saw the cake topper sitting safely on a shelf. The handcrafted porcelain piece Mason had paid $1,500 to commission. Clara lifted it carefully with both hands, pretending to admire it. The officers told her it was not hers to take. She nodded politely, then dropped it onto the floor. The porcelain shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. The sound echoed through the apartment like a final insult. One officer stepped between them before Clara could do more. He ordered her to return to packing and reminded her she was moments from arrest. Clara rolled her eyes, but obeyed with grudging reluctance. She gathered the last of her bags with trembling, furious hands. Linda hovered nearby, whispering spiteful remarks about Mason's character. Neither of them realized how small their anger looked compared to Mason's calm. The officers escorted them to the door once everything was collected. Clara paused in the entryway and glared back at Mason one last time. She said he would regret all of this. She said he would crawl back to her someday. Mason didn't respond. He simply held the door open and waited. Clara stepped into the hallway with a final dramatic huff. Linda followed, still muttering complaints and empty threats. The officers nodded to Mason and guided the 2 women away. The door closed quietly behind them. For the first time in months, the silence in the apartment felt peaceful rather than tense. Mason exhaled slowly as he surveyed the mess they left behind. It was chaos, but it was honest chaos. And he knew he could rebuild from here, without lies weighing him down. Mason spent the next morning walking through the apartment with a quiet determination. The scratches, the spills, and the torn fabric waited like reminders of the storm that had passed. He picked up the shattered porcelain pieces from the floor and placed them gently in a box. He scrubbed the spice-covered counters until the stains faded into nothing. He patched the holes in the mattress and wiped the marks from the walls. Each task felt less like cleaning and more like reclaiming his own space. He opened every window to let in fresh air, letting the apartment breathe again. The sunlight warmed the floorboards and made the room feel new. By noon, the chaos had transformed into order. The silence was no longer tense or suffocating. It felt like freedom, light and steady. Mason stood in the doorway of the living room and allowed himself a long breath. He realized he had not felt this calm in months. He realized he had finally stepped out of a life built on fear and half-truths. With the wedding funds safely returned to his account, he began planning something different. Not a ceremony, not a promise, a celebration of survival. He texted a group of close friends with a simple message. He invited them to a casual evening, gathering at his apartment. He called it the Single Again party, half joking and half genuine. Within minutes, replies started pouring in. People were excited, curious, supportive, and ready to show up. He ordered simple decorations and arranged some snacks on the counter. He played music that filled the apartment with warmth instead of tension. When the first guests arrived, they walked in with bright smiles and open arms. They hugged him, laughed with him, and listened as he shared pieces of the saga. Nobody judged him. Nobody questioned his choices. They only reminded him he had done the right thing. The party grew livelier as the evening unfolded. Laughter echoed through the apartment where arguments once lived. For the first time, he felt the space belonged entirely to him. Late into the night, after the last guest had left, Mason sat on the balcony alone. The city lights glimmered below like distant promises waiting to be discovered. He checked his phone out of habit and noticed a new message. It was from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakable. Ethan, the man whose name had started the unraveling. Ethan wrote that he had nothing to do with the invitations. He said Clara had reached out to him recently, but he never responded. He added one final line that made Mason exhale with unexpected clarity. He said Clara had always lived for drama, even when the past was long gone. Mason stared at the message for a moment before locking his phone. There was no anger left in him. Only relief. Relief that the truth had surfaced in its own time. Relief that he had escaped a future built on broken trust. He stood up and looked out at the night sky with a quiet sense of gratitude. He had lost money, time, and a few pieces of furniture. But he had gained something far more valuable. He had reclaimed his dignity, his peace, and the direction of his life. He walked back inside and closed the balcony door gently. The apartment felt lighter, almost hopeful. Mason smiled to himself with a calm certainty. He had not just ended a wedding. He had rewritten his entire future. Mason stood in the center of his quiet apartment and felt a clarity he had not known before. The chaos was behind him now, reduced to memories that no longer held power. He had lost money, time, and pieces of a life he once believed in. But every loss opened a door he had been afraid to touch. He realized that walking away was not a failure. It was a victory wrapped in honesty. He remembered Clara's promises, her excuses, and her anger. None of them mattered anymore. He had seen the truth hidden beneath her soft words. He had chosen himself when it counted most. The wedding was gone, but so was the weight that came with it. He breathed deeply and felt the air move freely through the room. For the first time, the future did not feel uncertain. It felt wide, open, and unshackled. Mason smiled as he turned off the lights and headed to bed. His life had been rewritten, not by revenge, but by clarity. And he knew he would never ignore his own voice again.